Hello, everyone. Imagine a voice so pure, so full of emotion, that it holds the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Picture a boy standing alone on a dimly lit stage, his heart laid bare in every note, his story woven into each melody like threads of shimmering gold. This is not just a story about music. It is a tale of resilience, of love that never fades, and of an unshakable hope that carries us through the darkest nights. Now, let us step into today's story together. The soft hum of the old record player filled the cozy living room, with the warm, crackling notes of Ella Fitzgerald's "Dream a Little Dream of Me." It was a Saturday tradition in the modest home of Eleanor and Nicholas, one that brought life to the otherwise quiet corners of their small world. Eleanor, her silver hair pinned neatly back, swayed gently in the kitchen, humming along as she stirred a pot of soup. Nicholas sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, the dim light catching the thoughtful furrow of his brow as he scribbled in his journal. At 14, he had the kind of seriousness in his eyes that spoke of a boy who had grown up faster than his years. "Grandma," Nicholas began, his voice tinged with hesitation. What was Mom like? It was a question he rarely asked, knowing the sorrow it summoned in Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor paused, the wooden spoon in her hand trembling slightly. "She had your kindness," she said softly, a wistful smile playing on her lips, and that same spark in her voice. When she sang, it was like the whole world stopped to listen. Nicholas looked down at his journal, a pang of longing coursing through him. He had only a single faded photograph of his mother, her smile frozen in time, holding a baby Nicholas close to her chest. His father, however, was a blank canvas, a mystery Eleanor rarely painted in words. The memory of his mother's absence was always there, like a shadow in the sunlight. Yet Eleanor had done everything to make their home a haven, her love filling the gaps left by loss. She encouraged Nicholas to dream, to sing, to let his voice carry him to places beyond their small town. But life, it seemed, had a cruel way of unraveling even the safest of havens. The signs of Eleanor's illness had been subtle at first: an unusual fatigue, a faint cough. Nicholas had dismissed them as the natural toll of age, but one fateful morning, he found her collapsed on the kitchen floor, her breath shallow and labored. Panic clawed at him as he dialed for help, his hands shaking. If you like this video, don't forget to click the subscribe button and ring the bell to receive notifications every time I release a new video. At the hospital, the doctor's words fell like stones into a bottomless well. "It's advanced. She'll need surgery, and even then," he trailed off, avoiding Nicholas's wide, tear-filled eyes. "It's going to be expensive." Nicholas clung to Eleanor's hand as if holding on could anchor her to this world. She smiled weakly, brushing a tear from his cheek. "Don't you worry, my boy," she whispered, her voice still laced with warmth despite her frailty. "We'll get through this." But the weight of their reality pressed heavy on Nicholas's shoulders. The savings Eleanor had carefully set aside over the years were a drop in the ocean compared to the costs they now faced. There was no family to turn to, no uncles, no aunts, no one. The world suddenly felt vast and unkind. 2 weeks later, Nicholas stood in the doorway of the orphanage, his small suitcase clutched tightly in his hand. The decision had not been his, nor Eleanor's. The state had intervened, deeming it in Nicholas's best interest to be placed in care while Eleanor underwent treatment. The orphanage loomed like a prison, its gray stone walls stark against the overcast sky. "Be brave, Nicholas," Eleanor had told him that morning, her voice trembling with both pride and heartbreak. "You've got a strong heart. Remember that." His goodbye was marked by a single, desperate embrace, her frail frame shaking against his. As the orphanage door creaked shut behind him, Nicholas felt the enormity of his solitude. The laughter of other children in the common room seemed a cruel mockery of his despair. The days at the orphanage passed in a haze of chores and muted conversations. But every night, as the other children drifted to sleep, Nicholas would sit by the window, humming softly to himself. Music was his refuge, a thread connecting him to the life he had left behind. His voice, tender and untrained, carried the pain of a boy far older than his years. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Nicholas found himself in the kitchen, helping Miss Beatrix, the kind-hearted cook, peel potatoes. She was a stout woman with kind eyes and a laugh that could warm the coldest of rooms. "You've got a beautiful voice, you know," she said, glancing at him over her glasses. "Ever thought about doing something with it?" Nicholas hesitated, the thought lingering in his mind. Singing had always been a private joy, something he shared only with Eleanor, but now it felt like his only lifeline. "I have to do something," he said quietly, his hands gripping the potato peeler. "Grandma needs me. She's all I have." Miss Beatrix set down her knife, her expression softening. "Well, if anyone can do it, it's you. Just be careful out there, Nicholas." Her words stayed with him, and that night, an idea began to form. A bold, reckless idea. If he couldn't earn enough money to save Eleanor from within the orphanage walls, he would find a way to do it outside them. The first time Nicholas snuck out, his heart pounded so loudly he was sure it would wake the entire house. Miss Beatrix had left the back door unlocked, her silent approval a quiet rebellion against the rules. Clutching an old harmonica case filled with spare change, Nicholas stepped into the biting cold of the city streets. He began small, singing on street corners and in subway stations, his trembling voice drawing curious glances and the occasional coin. His repertoire was limited, classic ballads Eleanor had taught him, but his voice carried a raw emotion that stopped people in their tracks. As the days turned into weeks, Nicholas's confidence grew. He ventured into cafes and small venues, his voice slowly gaining recognition. Yet the shadow of his circumstances loomed large. Every dollar he earned felt like a drop in the bucket, a cruel reminder of how far he still had to go. One night, as the city buzzed with holiday cheer, Nicholas found himself standing outside the V Lounge, a sleek establishment known for its elite clientele and live performances. The idea of stepping inside felt ludicrous. He was just a boy in second-hand clothes with nothing but a voice to his name. But desperation has a way of eclipsing fear. He pushed open the heavy doors, the warmth and chatter inside a stark contrast to the icy wind outside. The manager, Jack Rivera, was a stern man with sharp eyes and a permanent frown. Nicholas approached him, his small frame dwarfed by Jack's imposing presence. "For music," Nicholas began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "There's no age limit. Please, just give me a chance." Jack raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "All right, kid," he said after a long pause. "But if you're not as good as you claim, this will be your first and last performance." Nicholas swallowed hard, his resolve unshaken. "Deal." As he stepped onto the dimly lit stage, the weight of Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. "You've got a strong heart." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The lounge was a kaleidoscope of golden light and hushed murmurs as Nicholas stood on the stage, his heart pounding against his ribcage like a trapped bird. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, threatening to drown the courage that had carried him this far. Yet, in the warmth of the spotlight, he felt something else. A quiet resolve, a whisper of Eleanor's voice reminding him that he had a strong heart. The first note of "Fly Me to the Moon" left his lips tentatively, like a bird testing its wings. The piano accompaniment filled the room, soft and steady, as Nicholas's voice found its rhythm. With every line, his confidence grew, the melody soaring through the air with raw, unpolished beauty. It wasn't just a song. It was a plea, a promise, a prayer wrapped in melody. The room, which had been alive with quiet chatter, fell silent. Forks hovered mid-air, conversations died on lips, and all eyes turned toward the boy on the stage. There was something captivating about his performance, a depth of emotion that belied his years. At a table near the back, Roberta Clark swirled the wine in her glass absently. She was a picture of refinement, dressed in a tailored black dress, her dark curls framing a face etched with the marks of experience and loss. She was here tonight out of habit more than desire, the noise and laughter of the V-Lounge, a welcome distraction from the shadows of her past. When Nicolette's voice reached her ears, her hand froze mid-sip, her heart stuttered, an unfamiliar ache blooming in her chest. The sound was hauntingly familiar, like the echo of a memory she had buried long ago. She turned toward the stage, her breath catching as she saw the boy. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of the lights, stirred something deep within her. A fragile thread of recognition. Nicholas's voice reached its crescendo, the final note lingering in the air like the last light of dusk before the night claimed the sky. The audience erupted into applause, the sound washing over him like a wave. His chest heaved, his heart racing, but a small, tentative smile broke through his nerves. He had done it. Jack Ribera, standing at the bar with his arms crossed, gave a single approving nod. "You've got something, kid," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But Roberta didn't applaud. Her hands remained folded on the table, her eyes fixed on the boy with a mixture of wonder and unease. When the applause died down, Nicholas stepped off the stage, his legs trembling slightly as the adrenaline ebbed away. Jack approached him with a rare smile, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Well, you didn't embarrass me," Jack said gruffly, though there was a glimmer of pride in his tone. "You're hired, but don't think this is a free pass. Keep your grades up and don't slack off. Understood?" Nicholas nodded, his grin wide. "Thank you, Mr. Rivera. I won't let you down." As Nicholas slipped into the kitchen to catch his breath, Roberta stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The noise drew a few curious glances, but she paid them no mind. Her heart was pounding, the boy's voice still echoing in her ears. It was impossible, an illusion, a trick of the mind. Yet, something compelled her forward. She approached Jack, her voice low but urgent. "Who is that boy?" Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised by the intensity in her tone. "That's Nicholas. Just started tonight. Why?" Roberta hesitated, her mind a storm of thoughts. She didn't know what she was searching for. Answers? Closure? Or perhaps just the courage to face the ghosts of her past? "I need to speak with him." Jack's expression hardened slightly. "Look, Ms. Clark, he's just a kid trying to get by. If you've got some issue—" "It's not an issue," she interrupted, her voice softer now. "It's personal." In the kitchen, Nicholas was gulping down a glass of water when Jack walked in, his expression unreadable. "Nicholas," he said, jerking his thumb toward the dining area. "There's someone who wants to meet you." Nicholas frowned, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Who?" Jack shrugged. "A patron." "Go on, and don't make me regret this." With trepidation curling in his stomach, Nicholas followed Jack back into the lounge. Roberta was waiting near the bar, her posture stiff, her eyes scanning the crowd, until they landed on him. The moment their gazes met, she took an involuntary step forward. "Nicholas," she said, her voice faltering. That's your name, right?" He nodded slowly, unsure what to make of the strange intensity in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Roberta's breath hitched. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. The curve of his jaw, the way his eyes glinted with curiosity and caution. It was like looking at a younger version of someone she had loved and lost. "Your voice," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago." Nicholas tilted his head, confusion knitting his brow. "I don't think we've met." "No," Roberta said quickly, her cheeks coloring. "We haven't, but your father, do you know him?" The question hit Nicholas like a physical blow. He blinked, his breath catching as an old wound reopened. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've never met him." Roberta's shoulders sagged, disappointment flickering across her face. But before she could speak again, Nicholas squared his shoulders, his voice steadier now. "Why do you ask? Did you know him?" Her throat tightened, and she glanced away, struggling to compose herself. I think I did. A long time ago." "His name?" Nicholas pressed, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "Do you know his name?" Roberta hesitated, her gaze locking with his. In that moment, she saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the same vulnerability that had once belonged to Andre. "His name was Andre," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Andre Clark." The name landed like a thunderclap. Nicholas stared at her, his mind reeling. He had spent his entire life wondering, imagining. But now the truth was within reach, and it was almost too much to bear. "Andre," he whispered, tasting the name like a foreign word. "Is he alive?" Roberta nodded slowly, her own emotions threatening to spill over. "As far as I know." The world seemed to shift beneath Nicholas's feet. For years, his father had been a shadow, a question without an answer. Now, standing before this stranger who spoke his father's name, he felt both closer to the truth and further from understanding. "I need to know more," he said, his voice firm despite the turmoil within him. "Please." Roberta placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch hesitant but steady. "I'll help you," she said softly. "We'll find him together." In that moment, something shifted. For Nicholas, this was no longer just about saving Eleanor. It was about filling the void that had haunted him for so long. And as the weight of his new reality settled on his shoulders, he felt the stirrings of a determination that could not be quelled. He would find Andre, he would uncover the truth, and no matter how painful the answers might be, he would face them head on because he had a strong heart, and now he had a reason to use it. The weight of Roberta's revelation settled heavily on Nicholas's shoulders as he walked home that night. The streets glistened under a thin veil of rain, the amber glow of streetlights casting long shadows. Each step echoed with a question. Who is Andre Clark? His father was no longer just a ghost in his imagination. He was a man, alive somewhere, and that truth burned brighter than the uncertainty clouding it. Nicholas clutched the old scarf Eleanor had knit for him, wrapping it tighter as if to shield himself from the cold reality he was stepping into. His thoughts churned with equal parts dread and hope. He wasn't just a boy singing to save his grandmother anymore. He was a boy singing to uncover his legacy, to connect the pieces of his fractured past. But the journey ahead felt insurmountable. The next evening, Nicholas returned to the V Lounge. The quiet confidence of his debut had evolved into a steadfast determination. His voice, once tender with nerves, now carried an edge of resolve as he performed another jazz classic, Autumn Leaves. Each note seemed to reach into the hearts of his audience, drawing tears and applause in equal measure. Jack watched from the bar, his critical eye softening as he recognized something rare in the boy. "That kid doesn't just sing," he murmured to a bartender. "He makes people feel." But Nicholas's heart was elsewhere, even as he bowed to a standing ovation. His eyes sought out Roberta in the crowd, hoping for answers she might not yet have. When she approached him after the set, her expression was kind but guarded. "I've been thinking about what you said," Nicholas began, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "If Andre is alive, I need to find him." Roberta hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Nicholas, it's not that simple. Andre disappeared for a reason. There are things about his past that might be hard to hear." "Harder than never knowing?" Nicholas shot back, the fire in his eyes catching Roberta off guard. "He's my father. I need to know who he is, why he left, and I need to know if he'll help save my grandmother." Over the next few weeks, Roberta became an unexpected ally. She pieced together fragments of Andre's past, digging through old contacts and revisiting memories she had long buried. Nicholas, in the meantime, poured his soul into his performances, each song a step closer to the hope that his voice might one day reach his father's ears. The V Lounge began to buzz with whispers of the young boy who sang like an old soul. Jack, recognizing an opportunity, booked Nicholas for more frequent performances, but his success came with strict terms. He had to keep his grades up and maintain his secrecy at the orphanage. Miss Beatrix became his confidant, helping him sneak out night after night. "You're playing with fire, Nicholas," she warned one evening as she handed him a packed dinner. "But I can see it in your eyes. You're not going to stop." "I can't stop, Miss Beatrix," Nicholas replied, his voice firm. "Not until I've done everything I can." One night, after a particularly moving rendition of What a Wonderful World, a man approached Nicholas as he stepped off the stage. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with a sharp gaze that seemed to pierce through Nicholas's young confidence. "That was extraordinary," the man said, extending a hand. "Name's Edward Hall. I'm a producer." Nicholas froze, his hand hovering uncertainly before shaking Edward's. "Thank you, sir," he replied cautiously. Edward's smile widened. "You've got raw talent, kid. With the right backing, you could be something great. What do you say? Let me make you a star." Nicholas hesitated, the weight of the offer pressing down on him. Fame and fortune weren't what he sought. He wanted to save Eleanor, to find Andre, to uncover the truth about himself. But was this an opportunity he could afford to pass up? I'll think about it," Nicholas said finally, his tone polite but firm. Edward raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to hesitation, but he nodded. "Don't take too long, kid. Talent like yours doesn't wait." As Nicholas navigated his growing success, Roberta made a breakthrough. She discovered an address. A modest house outside Chicago where Andre had reportedly been seen. The news sent a jolt of nervous energy through Nicholas. The morning they planned to leave, Nicholas stood outside the orphanage clutching his small suitcase. Miss Beatrix had tears in her eyes as she hugged him tightly. "You've got a heart of gold, Nicholas," she whispered. "Don't let this world change you." He smiled through his own tears. "Thank you for everything, Miss Beatrix. I'll come back." The journey to Chicago was long, the tension in the car thick with unspoken fears. Roberta drove in silence, her hands gripping the wheel as she stole glances at Nicholas. His face was set with determination, but she could see the worry in his eyes, the fear of rejection, of disappointment. As they pulled up to the small house, Nicholas's heart pounded like a drum. The place was unremarkable, a single-story home with a weathered porch. Yet, to Nicholas, it was a fortress, holding the answers he had spent his life searching for. "Are you ready?" Roberta asked gently. Nicholas nodded, though his legs felt like lead as he stepped out of the car. Each step toward the door felt heavier than the last. He raised a trembling hand and knocked. The door creaked open, revealing a man whose face mirrored Nicholas's own in subtle, haunting ways. Andre Clark was older, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes tired but sharp. For a moment, neither spoke, the air between them thick with emotion. "Who are you?" Andre asked, his voice guarded. Nicholas swallowed hard, his hand clenching at his sides. "My name is Nicholas," he said, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "I think you're my father." Andre's expression faltered, a flicker of recognition breaking through his guarded exterior. "Nicholas," he repeated softly, the name trembling on his lips. I didn't think I'd ever see you." The conversation that followed was raw and painful. Andre admitted to leaving to protect Nicholas and Eleanor from enemies who had once threatened his life. He had spent years living in obscurity, haunted by guilt, but convinced it was the only way to keep them safe. "Do you know what it's like to grow up without a father?" Nicholas asked, his voice breaking. "To watch your grandmother work herself to exhaustion to fill the void you left?" Andre's shoulders slumped, his regret palpable. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly. "But I was wrong. I see that now." Despite the pain, Nicholas felt a spark of hope. Andre wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was real, and he wanted to make amends. Together, they devised a plan to raise the money for Eleanor's surgery. Andre, once a talented musician himself, joined Nicholas in performances, their combined talent drawing even larger crowds to the V-Lounge. For the first time in years, Nicholas felt the pieces of his life begin to fit together. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he faced it with a newfound strength, his voice carrying the weight of his journey and the promise of what lay ahead. And as he sang each night, his heart swelled with the belief that no matter how difficult the climb, the view from the top would be worth it. For Eleanor, for Andre, for himself. The V-Lounge was packed that night, the air electric with anticipation. Word of Nicholas and Andre's performances had spread like wildfire, and the once exclusive venue now drew crowds from every corner of the city. The soft hum of conversation swirled in the dimly lit room, the stage standing like a sacred altar, waiting for the father and son duo to weave their magic. Behind the curtain, Nicholas paced nervously. His hands were clammy, his heart racing. He had sung on this stage countless times, but tonight was different. Tonight, it wasn't just about the music. It was about proving something to himself, to Andre, and perhaps most importantly, to Eleanor, who rested in a hospital bed miles away. Andre sat quietly in the corner, tuning his guitar. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, but his face betrayed the storm within. The years he had spent in hiding, running from his past, had caught up to him. Now, under the glaring spotlight of his son's determination, there was no escape. "Are you nervous?" Andre asked, breaking the silence. Nicholas stopped pacing and turned to face his father. A little," he admitted, "but mostly I just want this to be enough." Andre set the guitar down and crossed the room, placing a hand on Nicholas's shoulder. "It already is," he said, his voice steady but soft. "You're doing something I could never have done. You're facing the world head on, no matter how hard it gets." Nicholas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Let's make tonight count." As the house lights dimmed, the crowd fell silent. Nicholas stepped onto the stage first, his figure illuminated by a single spotlight. The murmurs in the audience stilled, replaced by a collective breath held in anticipation. Andre followed, his guitar slung over his shoulder, the sight of him drawing quiet murmurs from those who recognized the legendary musician he once was. The first notes of What a Wonderful World filled the room, Andre's gentle strumming laying a foundation for Nicholas's voice to rise like a tide. He sang with a depth of emotion that silenced every whisper, each word a tribute to the woman who had raised him, the father he was beginning to know, and the life he was fighting to rebuild. As the final note faded into the air, the audience erupted into applause, the sound thunderous. But before the next song could begin, a figure in the crowd stood abruptly, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. It was Roberta. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the back of a chair for support. Her wide, tear-filled eyes were locked on Andre, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anguish. "Andre," she said, her voice breaking. "Is it really you?" Andre froze, his fingers hovering over the strings of his guitar. The color drained from his face as he recognized her. "Roberta," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Nicholas turned to his father, confusion flashing across his face. "You know her?" Andre didn't respond, his gaze fixed on Roberta. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable. Slowly, Andre set his guitar down and stepped forward, the weight of decades crashing down on him. "Roberta," he said again, louder this time. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Tears streamed down her face as she took a step closer. "You disappeared," she said, her voice trembling. "You left me without a word. And now I find you here, after all these years." Nicholas felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting. He looked between his father and Roberta, his mind racing. "What's going on?" he demanded. "What aren't you telling me?" Andre turned to his son, his face etched with guilt. "Nicholas," he began, his voice heavy, "there's something you need to know." The words spilled out in a torrent, each one more shocking than the last. Andre revealed that Roberta had been the love of his life, a woman he had planned to marry. But their happiness had been shattered when Andre found himself entangled in a dangerous business deal that spiraled out of control. To protect Roberta, and later Eleanor and Nicholas, he had faked his own death and disappeared, leaving everything behind. "I thought I was keeping you safe," Andre said, his voice breaking, "but all I did was leave a trail of broken hearts." Nicholas stared at his father, anger and hurt boiling within him. "You thought running away was the answer? Do you have any idea what you left behind? What you did to her? To us?" Andre hung his head, the weight of his choices bearing down on him. "I was a coward," he admitted, "but I want to make it right." Roberta shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You can't undo the past, Andre," she said, her voice sharp but tinged with sorrow. "But maybe you can try." The evening that had started with music and hope descended into chaos as emotions ran high. The audience watched, captivated as the drama unfolded before them. But through the storm of revelations, one thing became clear to Nicholas. He had the strength to move forward, even if the path was uncertain. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "We can't change what happened," he said, looking at both Andre and Roberta, "but we can decide what happens next. I'm not giving up. On Grandma, on you, or on myself." The sincerity in his voice cut through the tension like a blade. Andre and Roberta exchanged a glance, their shared pain tempered by the hope shining in Nicholas's eyes. As the night drew to a close, the three of them sat together in the quiet of the lounge, the hum of conversations and clinking glasses fading into the background. Andre reached for Roberta's hand, his touch hesitant but sincere. "I'm sorry for everything," he said. "For leaving. For hurting you. If I could take it all back, "You can't," Roberta interrupted gently. "But maybe we can find a way to move forward, for Nicholas's sake." Nicholas watched them, a strange mix of emotions swirling within him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. His family, fractured and flawed, was beginning to heal. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, Nicholas stood outside the hospital, clutching a bouquet of Eleanor's favorite flowers. The surgery was scheduled for later that day, and while the money they had raised wasn't enough to cover everything, Roberta had stepped in to cover the rest. Nicholas took a deep breath, his heart heavy but resolute. "We'll make it, Grandma," he whispered to himself. "I promise." As he walked through the hospital doors, he felt a newfound strength coursing through him, a strength born from the chaos of the night before, from the connections he had fought to rebuild, and from the belief that no matter how broken the pieces, they could always be put back together. In that moment, Nicholas wasn't just a boy trying to save his grandmother. He was a boy who had found his voice, his courage, and the unyielding will to fight for the people he loved. And that was a song no one could ever silence. The hospital corridors were quiet, save for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Nicholas sat in a stiff plastic chair outside the surgical wing, his hands clasped tightly together, the bouquet of lilies he'd brought for Eleanor resting on the chair beside him. His mind swirled with a storm of emotions: fear for his grandmother, anger at Andre for his past mistakes, and an overwhelming exhaustion that seemed to settle into his very bones. Across from him, Andre sat with his head bowed, his hands resting on his knees. The man who had once seemed larger than life to Nicholas now looked small, weighed down by guilt and years of regret. Roberta stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly, as if holding herself together. Her gaze was fixed on the sky, where the sun had begun to break through the clouds, scattering golden light across the horizon. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with words left unsaid. Finally, Nicholas broke it, his voice trembling but firm. "She has to be okay," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "She's always been the strongest person I know." Andre looked up, his eyes shadowed with regret. "She's strong because she had to be," he said quietly. "I left her to carry a burden that wasn't hers to bear. And now, I might lose the chance to tell her I'm sorry." Nicholas turned to his father, his chest tightening. He wanted to lash out, to blame Andre for the years of pain and uncertainty. But as he looked into the man's eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected: vulnerability. Andre wasn't just the man who had left. He was also a man who had suffered, who had lived with his mistakes every day. "We can't change the past," Nicholas said, his voice softer now. "But if she pulls through, maybe we can try to make things right for her." Andre nodded, his throat working as he fought to contain his emotions. "For her," he echoed. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Roberta, unable to sit still any longer, walked over to Nicholas and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done so much for her, Nicholas," she said gently. "More than most people could ever imagine. She's proud of you. I know it." Nicholas looked up at her, his eyes glistening. "I just want her to see everything we've been working for, to know that it wasn't for nothing." Roberta's heart ached for him. She knelt down beside his chair, meeting his gaze. "She knows, Nicholas. Even if she doesn't wake up, she knows. Your voice, your courage, it's all a reflection of her love for you." The thought of losing Eleanor was unbearable, but Roberta's words planted a small seed of hope in Nicholas's heart. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "She has to wake up," he whispered. "She just has to." When the surgeon finally emerged, Nicholas shot to his feet, his heart pounding. Andre and Roberta followed suit, their expressions tense with anticipation. The surgery was a success, the doctor said, a small smile softening his otherwise serious demeanor. She's stable now, but the next 48 hours will be critical. You can see her, but only one at a time. Nicholas's legs nearly gave out from relief. He felt Andre's hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Go," Andre said softly. "She needs you the most." Nicholas nodded and followed the nurse down the corridor to Eleanor's room. As he stepped inside, the sight of her took his breath away. She looked frail against the crisp white sheets, her face pale but peaceful. The steady beep of the heart monitor was a reassuring sound, a reminder that she was still here. He sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "Grandma," he said softly, his voice trembling, "it's me. I'm here." Eleanor's eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused at first, but then sharpening as it landed on Nicholas. A faint smile curved her lips. "My boy," she whispered, her voice weak but full of love. "You're here." Tears streamed down Nicholas's face as he leaned closer. "I promised you I'd take care of you, and I will. We're going to be okay. All of us." The following days were a blur of cautious optimism. Eleanor's condition improved steadily, and though she was still weak, her spirit remained unbroken. She insisted on meeting Andre, her voice firm despite her frailty. "It's time," she said to Nicholas. "I've carried this weight for too long. It's time for him to face it." When Andre walked into her hospital room, he froze, his eyes welling up as he took in the sight of her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry." Eleanor studied him for a long moment before reaching out her hand. "You should be," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But we don't have time to waste on blame. Nicholas needs us, now, both of us." If you find it interesting, please comment number 2. If it is not interesting, please press number 1 so we can fix the content to be better and better. Andre took her hand, his shoulders shaking as tears spilled down his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm began to emerge. Andre became a constant presence in Nicholas's life, helping him balance school, his performances, and his visits to Eleanor. Roberta, too, stayed close, her bond with both father and son deepening with each passing day. Nicholas's voice, already powerful, seemed to carry even more emotion as he sang at the V Lounge. Each performance was a tribute, not just to Eleanor, but to the journey that had brought them here. The audiences grew larger, and the whispers of his talent began to reach the ears of music producers. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, Edward Hall approached Nicholas again, this time with an offer he couldn't refuse: a recording contract. "Your voice deserves to be heard by the world," Edward said. "What do you say?" Nicholas hesitated, glancing at Andre and Eleanor, who sat together at a table near the stage. Their smiles were full of pride and encouragement. He turned back to Edward and nodded. "Let's do it." As the months turned into years, Nicholas's life transformed. His music reached audiences far beyond the V Lounge, and his story of perseverance and family reconciliation resonated with listeners everywhere. But no matter how far his career took him, he never forgot the people who had shaped him. Eleanor, though still frail, lived to see her grandson's first album release. At the launch party, she stood beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his. "You've made me so proud, my boy," she said, her eyes shining. "Your voice has always been your greatest gift." Nicholas smiled, his heart full. "It's not just my voice, Grandma. It's yours too. Everything I am, I owe to you." The closing chapter of their journey was marked by forgiveness, understanding, and a deep sense of gratitude. Andre and Roberta found solace in each other, rebuilding their relationship while remaining a steadfast support for Nicholas. And Nicholas, once a boy burdened by loss and uncertainty, grew into a young man whose voice carried hope, resilience, and love. On a warm summer evening, as Nicholas stood on the stage of a sold-out concert, he spotted Eleanor, Andre, and Roberta in the front row. Their faces, lit by the glow of the stage lights, were filled with pride and joy. Taking the microphone, Nicholas addressed the crowd. "This song is for my family," he said, his voice steady but brimming with emotion. "For the people who taught me what it means to fight, to forgive, and to love." And as he sang, his voice rising like a beacon into the night, it was clear to everyone in the room that Nicholas wasn't just singing a song. He was telling a story of loss and redemption, of broken pieces made whole, and of a boy who found his voice and used it to heal the world around him. The night sky above the V Lounge glittered with stars, their light weaving a tapestry of endless possibilities. Nicholas stood backstage, adjusting the cuffs of his crisp white shirt, his fingers trembling, not with nerves, but with the weight of the journey that had brought him here. Tonight wasn't just another performance. It was a homecoming, a celebration, and the closing of one chapter in preparation for the next. Behind the velvet curtain, the murmurs of the crowd rose and fell like waves on a distant shore. Familiar faces filled the room. Eleanor, seated in her wheelchair, her frailty overshadowed by the strength in her gaze. Andre and Roberta, side by side, a quiet harmony born from shared scars and healing. The lounge was full, but for Nicholas, these three people were his entire audience. They were his past, his present, in the foundation of the future he was building, note by note. The stage lights dimmed as Nicholas stepped forward, the applause washing over him like a warm tide. In the silence that followed, he took a deep breath, his heart swelling with gratitude and resolve. "This song," he began, his voice steady but soft, "is for everyone who has ever felt lost, for those who've had to find their way in the dark. It's for my family, the ones who never gave up on me, even when life felt impossible." The first chords of Over the Rainbow floated into the air, each note tender and deliberate, like the beginning of a story. As Nicholas sang, his voice carried the weight of every tear, every triumph, and every unanswered question that had brought him to this moment. The song wasn't just music. It was a map of his heart, a journey that led to the people who had helped him find his way home. From her seat, Eleanor watched with tears in her eyes. Nicholas's voice had always been beautiful, but tonight it was something more. It was a beacon, a light that shone not just for him, but for everyone who had ever faced hardship and dared to hope. She thought of the countless nights she had spent praying for him, for herself, for a future that seemed out of reach. And now, here he was, a boy who had grown into a man, standing tall against the backdrop of a world that had once tried to silence him. Eleanor's hand tightened around Andre's, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's everything I dreamed he'd be," she said. Andre nodded, his throat tightening. "And more," he replied, "so much more." As the final note lingered in the air, the audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet in a thunderous ovation. Nicholas stood there, soaking in the moment, the sound filling every hollow part of him that had once ached with doubt. His chest swelled with pride, not for himself, but for the family that had made this possible. He stepped forward, gesturing for Eleanor, Andre, and Roberta to join him on stage. The crowd quieted as they made their way to his side, their presence turning the performance into something greater, a testament to love, resilience, and forgiveness. I scarcely know how to thank you for helping me get through David's loss. It was hard to take such an incredible burden. Here he was with his strength and his gifts revealed to me, My grandmother who taught me what it means to love unconditionally. My father who showed me that it's never too late to make things right. And Roberta who reminded me that the past doesn't have to define us. The room filled with warmth, a collective understanding passing through the crowd like a ripple across a still lake. It wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a moment, one that would live in the hearts of everyone present. As the applause began anew, Nicholas turned to Eleanor, his eyes glistening. "This is for you, Grandma," he said, his voice barely audible over the cheers. "You gave me my voice." Eleanor smiled, her expression radiant. "And you've made it your own, my boy," she whispered. "You've turned it into something beautiful." The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Nicholas's music began to reach audiences far beyond the walls of the V-Lounge. His first album, Echoes of Hope, climbed the charts, its songs resonating with people from all walks of life. Each track carried a piece of his story, a story of loss, resilience, and the unyielding power of love. Eleanor's health continued to improve, her strength returning little by little. She insisted on attending every one of Nicholas's local performances, her pride in him shining brighter than ever. Andre and Roberta, too, found their own rhythm, their relationship healing as they built a new future together. One crisp autumn morning, Nicholas stood in a quiet park, the leaves around him a symphony of gold and crimson. Eleanor sat on a nearby bench, bundled in a woolen coat, her cheeks rosy from the chill. Andre and Roberta were beside her, their laughter blending with the rustling leaves. Nicholas held his guitar, strumming softly as he looked at the people who had become his anchor. "I used to think I was alone," he said, his voice carrying on the breeze. "But now I know. I've always had you." Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling but steady in its intent. "And you always will," she said firmly. As Nicholas played, his music filled the park, drawing the attention of passers-by. Some stopped to listen, their faces softening as the melody wove its way into their hearts. It wasn't a grand stage or a sold-out concert, but for Nicholas, it was perfect. Here, surrounded by the people he loved, he found peace. The years passed and Nicholas's star continued to rise, but he never forgot where he came from. Every performance, every song, was a tribute to the journey that had shaped him. He remained grounded, his heart rooted in the lessons Eleanor had taught him and the connections he had fought to rebuild. One evening, as he stood on the stage of a packed stadium, Nicholas paused before his final song. He looked out at the sea of faces, his heart swelling with gratitude. "This isn't just my story," he said, his voice echoing through the vast space. "It's ours. It's a story about love, about forgiveness, about never giving up, even when the odds feel impossible." And as he sang, his voice soaring into the night, it became clear that Nicholas wasn't just a singer. He was a storyteller, a healer, a beacon of hope for all who listened. His journey, once marked by pain and loss, had become a symbol of everything beautiful about the human spirit, its ability to endure, to forgive, and to find joy in the face of adversity. The final note lingered, a promise carried on the wind, that no matter how dark the night, the dawn would always come, bringing with it the light of new beginnings. And in that light, Nicholas stood tall, his voice a testament to the unbreakable bond of family, the strength of forgiveness, and the power of love.